tells you that there is something out there.
Pretty hard to spoof that.
Absolutely. Los Alamos, Oak Ridge National Labs, MacDill Air Force Base, Edwards Air Force Base, the remote test site in Nevada, also known as Air Force Flight Test Center Detachment 3. That's the actual terminology for Groom Lake facility.
From what I hear you guys saying, there's something.
I don't know who's building it, who's got the technology, who's got the brains, but there's something out there that better than our airplane.
So it's not us. That's one thing we know.
You know that.
I could say that with a very high degree of confidence.
For someone to try to bust down the walls, it's not going to happen. You'd have to go to all these facilities, get into their vaults, then bring that out as a united coalition. Not one person couldn't do it. It would take a united coalition of acknowledged scientists to come forward with it. Hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining me today. I do want to appreciate all the support. The subscriptions are going up. I want to thank you for that. And again, the goal of this channel is to preserve an important part of our national history through the use of slides, illustrations, drawings, sketches to really make these cases come alive. So thanks again for that. Now, what we're going to do tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is we are going to talk about USOs. It's this forgotten facet of ufology, unidentified submerged objects. It's almost completely forgotten about. There's a little bit of mention of it around the kind of the perimeter of this field, but it hasn't been given the credit it deserves. So we're going to talk about USOs on this episode. So we'll move ahead to the next slide now. All right, so what we've got here is, we've all heard of this Condon report, and I'll just break it down here. The government-sponsored 1969 University of Colorado $600,000 Condon report failed to mention any USO cases. Of the 1,517 foreign or non-American cases categorized by Jacques Vallée, 50% were at sea. So, ladies and gentlemen, how can the U.S. government claim that they've made an objective effort to research the UFO field when they missed out on 50% of the evidence? How is this even possible? They missed out on all the USO cases, so they really haven't done an objective survey or research effort. So we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so the sources for this information tonight are going to be Undersea UFO Base by Preston Dennett, who definitely deserves a lot of credit for really being a premier researcher on USO. So he's written multiple books, done so many interviews on USO, so he really deserves a lot of credit. And we'll move on to the next source here. Okay, this is one of these books, Invisible Residents by Ivan T. Sanderson, The Reality of Underwater UFOs. So I want to highlight this book, everybody, because if you have anyone that's skeptical about this field, anyone who might be sitting on the fence, someone at work, a family member, someone you know at the doctor's office, if they're kind of reluctant to engage the field, or they're somewhat skeptical, they're sitting on the fence, if they read this book, I guarantee, if they read this book with an open mind, you cannot walk away thinking there's nothing to this phenomenon. This book nails it so hard that you just cannot walk away thinking there's nothing to this. I really think it clinches it. All right, we'll move on to the next slide and get into some of these here. Now, approximately 15 years ago, I was given access to the Ivan T. Sanderson collection, and just to prove that I really did, this is a photograph I took of the binder, and what it contains, ladies and gentlemen, is literally hundreds of these USO cases documented by the U.S. Navy, newspaper articles, personal research. So given access to the collection, and this is an example of what these cases look like. We'll move on to the next slide, and I'll show you a page that I scanned in. This is typically what they look like. There's kind of a small little one or two sentence description. Then there's a reference of where they got that, and it's just page after page of these. U.S. Navy reports, reports from Japan, international reports all over. So what we're going to do is we're going to deep dive into some of these cases. We'll move on to the next slide here. All right, so let's go ahead and start at the top here. A couple of months ago, San Francisco Bay Area police were swamped with telephone calls reporting that hundreds of boats were gathered just offshore. Search by Coast Guard, there was no result, but other calls reported hundreds of red and orange lights bobbing in the ocean just south of Golden Gate Park. Again, investigators revealed nothing. So the reference is Fate, March 24th, page 9. Next one, 9:50 p.m., 12:56. So we've got Swedish ship wired harbor control at Lagaria that a cone-shaped object was falling vertically into the sea off Venezuela coast. It was very bright and gave off strange glares. When the object hit the water, an explosion was heard. Then the sea where the object fell became brilliantly colored. After the colors subsided, the sea became very disturbed with a boiling motion, which continued for some time. Now, references April Bulletin, January 1964. Where, ladies and gentlemen, where have we heard about this disturbance on the top part of the ocean associated with a USO? It's that Tic Tac case again. So here in 64, they already had that. It's already been done here. So we'll look at this final case here for this particular section, April 19th, 1957. Crew members aboard Kitsukawa Maru, a Japanese fishing boat, spotted two metallic silvery objects descending from the sky, which suddenly dove into the sea. The objects were without wings, estimated to be 10 meters long. As they hit the water, and we'll see if we can see this here, I think there was a disturbance. Looks like it's slightly cut off here. But again, April 1957, two objects came in, and there's just case after case of these sightings. So we'll move on to the next slide here. All right. In some cases, you really have to go outside the United States to get some really good data. So here's Canadian UFO report, and they did a really nice report on USOs, a study of flying saucers and other aerial phenomena. Again, nice report on USOs, and we'll move on to the next slide here. All right, now I want to talk about this particular case. So this is the USS Wasp off the coast of Puerto Rico. There were 5 naval ships and 2 submarines involved in this kind of a naval training exercise. And ladies and gentlemen, they tracked a USO going like 150 knots at 27,000 feet. This is back in 1963. So who had the technology in 1963 to pull this off, to go 150 knots at 27,000 feet? And it was tracked by US Navy. They got this. They have the records for this. You could actually pull this if you had the resources and the connections to do it. But 1963, this is already going on. It's confirmed by the US Navy. We'll move on to the next case here. All right, so again, I want to reference Preston Dennett. So we've got multiple cases in Catalina Island, 1992. There were, I would say, about 12 eyewitnesses, this is off the coast of Catalina Island, who saw all these lighted objects just below the surface. And then these things popped up out of the sea and then flew away. This is just off the coast of Catalina Island, June 14th, 1993. We'll move on to the next slide to show you what it looked like when they came out. So here's what they looked like when they came out. And this happens again and again and again in Catalina Island. Preston Dennett has just done a really good job documenting these cases. There is something going on, definitely near the vicinity of the coast of Catalina Island. We'll move on to the next case here. Okay, so this is another Catalina Island case, February 7th, 1989. And what happened here is something that looks similar to this illustration. It kind of went up to the surface. It stayed there for about 60 seconds. It launched these smaller disc-shaped craft off its back and then re-submerged without the discs on the back. This is, again, February 7th, 1989. We'll move on to the next slide to give you an idea of what these things actually look like. So here it is on the surface, and this is just a few seconds before it released these smaller craft off the spine or back of, you could call it, the mothership craft that was just kind of floating on the top surface. And we'll move on to the next slide here. Okay, August 4th, 1967. This is right in the Gulf of Venezuela there. And this gentleman was fishing in this coast. Really interesting case. And he just noticed this ring about 18 feet in diameter of this boiling water. And out from this ring comes this turquoise sphere that was it had water dripping off the side of it. It had triangular, you could call them indentations, wrapped around the outer circumference that were rotating. And then this thing, as the water was dripping off, it flew away at a high rate of speed. This is 1967, well-documented case. All right, we'll move on to the next slide now. Okay, USS FDR, October 2nd, 1963. So this is another one of these USS FDR cases. We already talked about one in the first episode of this series, but here's another one. And again, why is the USS FDR so involved in these UFO, USO sightings? Is it possibly because the USS FDR was the first aircraft carrier to carry nuclear weapons on board? We should ask that question. So let's set up the scene here. Initial contact was 600 miles from the ship at an altitude of 80,000 feet. Then, whatever this craft was, it approached the ship at a range of 10 miles and 15,000 feet. At that point, this craft started making these tremendous right-angle turns. It was clocked on radar at 4,000 miles an hour. At that point, the ship launched 2 F-4 Phantoms to intercept, which they didn't do. The craft came back, and this time it was only a few hundred feet from the ship itself, in view of at least 24 naval personnel on the aircraft carrier. So this is, again, October 2nd, 1963, USS FDR. We'll move on to the next case here. All right, this is an interesting case. I really like this case. It came from beneath the sea. Dr. Ruben J. Vilela, a Brazilian scientist aboard an icebreaker in Admiralty Bay, and this is confirmed in the Ivan T. Sanderson reports, in the Antarctic, was shocked out of his senses when he saw a strange craft shoot up out of the sea through more than 37 feet of ice. Who can do this? 37 feet of solid ice. This bullet-shaped craft punches through the ice. It makes this round hole as these huge chunks of ice are slamming back down on the ice surface. And then it leaves this boiling circle where it took off. We'll move on to the next slide here. Here again, 1955, Antarctica, Operation Deep Freeze, Admiralty Bay, USCGC Eastwind. This is the ship that actually saw this. And there were crew members aboard the ship that actually witnessed this bullet-shaped craft punching through 37 feet of solid ice back in 1955. Who's got the technology to do this? Let's move on to the next slide here. Okay, this is an illustration that I commissioned my friend William McDonald to do for me. And you can see the ship in the background here and this strange craft breaking through the ice. Can you imagine these huge chunks just flying off into the sky and then slamming back down? And then it's got this hole cut out of boiling water as this thing flies out into space. Really good case, documented in Ivan T. Sanderson's book, Invisible Residents. And we'll move on to the next slide here. Okay, so my question is, they're punching through 37 feet of solid ice. Now, if you look at what we can do, what can man-made technology do? This is U.S. Navy fast attack submarines. They can break through 37 inches of solid ice, but not through 37 feet of solid ice. So we're talking about another level of technology here, no doubt about it. We'll move on to the next slide. Reports we've received of these very strange bullet-shaped craft punching out of the ocean right within the vicinity of these Russian Navy Typhoon-class boomer submarines during the Reagan administration. So what is the source material for these particular cases? We'll move on to the next slide. I'm going to show you and give you some references here. Paul Stonehill and Philip Mantle, Russia's USO Secret. So you can read about some of these cases within this book. So it's well documented. We do have the references for it. We'll move on to the next slide here. Okay, now I want to highlight this particular building. This is Clarksburg, West Virginia. This is the Special Collections Library. And within this library, ladies and gentlemen, it's open to the public. Clarksburg, West Virginia, they have the Gray Barker collection, who was a UFO researcher, 60s and 70s into the 80s. And he amassed a gigantic collection of material. Again, it's open to the public. There's about 18 file cabinets, and there's just thousands and thousands and thousands of reports, drawings, documents. Now, within this collection, there's something called the auto binder reports that I've mentioned a couple times before, but since we're doing this little episode here on USOs, I thought it'd be a good idea to mention these again. So after about 12 years that it took to actually pull these files out, 2 visits, I was able to secure copies of all 300 cases. Now this is between 1965 and 1969. Auto Binder published a weekly column called Our Space Age, which included UFO sightings from around the world. So there'd be like a 2-sentence description of the case. There'd be a drawing or illustration to go with it. And it was just week after week, hundreds of these cases, and they're really good cases. We'll move on. We'll begin to show you some of these here with the next slide. So here's the original one. You can see the drawing. We've got the text here, and we'll do a first read over on the case from the very beginning. Then I'll show you the full color illustration that we've created here. April 19th, 1959, near Japan, aboard a fishing boat, the amazed crew spotted 2 saucers diving into the ocean at terrific speed, yet no wreckage was ever found, as if the UFOs had deliberately submerged for an underwater trip. Now, if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to show you our color version of this thing. Here it is. So you can imagine these people on this fishing trawler here, they see these craft just diving into the ocean like it was no problem. They could go from one medium to the next with no problem. And that's what's interesting about this phenomenon. When you talk about UFOs and USOs, it's interesting because UFOs are tricksters, right? They can come and go as they please. They can materialize and dematerialize as they please. They can make right angle turns that seem to be no G-forces whatsoever. They're not affected by it. They can go into the sides of mountains with no impact. They can go into oceans with literally no effect whatsoever. There's no impact. They're fine. There's no damage to the craft whatsoever. Now there's a splash in many cases, but there's no damage to the craft. We'll move on to the next slide here. Okay, so here's the next one. June 3rd, 1961, Savona, Italy. Gaikama Bara and his companions felt waves rocking their motorboat, then saw a huge UFO rise up out of the sea and sail off through the sky as if equally at home in the ocean or in the air. We just mentioned that. We'll move on to the color slide next here. And here we go. Again, what would it be like to actually see this in real life? Again, case after case of these fishing trawlers seeing these things. And this has been going on for hundreds of years, documented within the Ivan T. Sanderson collection. We'll move on to the next slide now. 1882, near Ascension Isle, a British steamer came upon a gigantic UFO floating in the ocean, at least 800 feet long or nearly as big as the Queen Elizabeth, which slowly sank beneath the waves and vanished from sight. So 1882, this is before June 24th, 1947, Kenneth Arnold. This predates all of the modern day UFO reports. So this has been going on, ladies and gentlemen. We're talking, well over 100 years here. So what are we dealing with here? Who is responsible for these? Who's building these? Are they built? Are they interdimensional? All these questions we should ask here. Next slide, then we'll move on. This is what the full color illustration looks like, and you can see the size of this thing, just incredible. And slowly sank. So it certainly seems that it was somewhat, wouldn't call it man, but it certainly had intelligence to it at the very least. We'll move on to the next slide here. Next one, 1909, July 30th, 1909. This is in New Zealand. Men aboard a dredge reported a boat-shaped UFO that circled all around with 2 human-like figures visible inside. Credit Tony Brunt. So at least they had some kind of a reference for it here. But 1909, who's flying these in 1909? The Wright brothers just flew December 17th, 1903. So this is just a couple of years after them. They've already got flying triangles with cockpits, crews that could hover above craft. This is back in 1909. Who's building these? Who's responsible for this? Is it a high-tech civilization that's already been pre-existing on this planet? We should explore that option as well. We'll move on to the next slide here. And here's the full color version. What could this have been? Who was piloting? Where did they come from? All these questions that we should ask. instead of just saying that there's nothing to this phenomenon like some government officials like to say. We'll move on to the next slide here. Okay, this one I like. November 13th, 1833, a crowd on both the American and Canadian sides saw a peculiar square-shaped UFO hover over Niagara Falls for an hour, after which it sped away toward the ocean. Ladies and gentlemen, 1833, these things are being seen. 1833, this predates practically everything. Predates all modern day UFO sightings for sure. So again, another one of these interesting cube-shaped UFOs. We'll move on to the next slide. I'll show you the color version here. And here's our color version. Credit goes to Tom Bogan for putting these together and bringing these up to kind of modern day standards. Can you imagine you're with your wife and you're looking at this thing hovering over Niagara Falls, seen by multiple eyewitnesses back in 1833. We'll move on to the next slide. Okay, May 1967, Mr. X, name withheld by request, of Anderson, South Carolina, was fishing on Hartwell Lake and saw an octagonal UFO apparently pumping up water through a metal tube. Mr. X was near enough to cast and strike the object, but nobody came out, and soon it shot away into the sky. Back in 1967, we've got this octagonal UFO, USO perhaps, just kind of like floating on there, and then pumping up water through a pipe. And then this thing flew away. So who's doing this? Who's responsible? Let me go on to the next slide here, and we'll show you the colorized version. And I call these the water pumper UFOs. I've got at least 3 cases of these strange UFO water pumpers. Are they cooling something? Is there a nuclear reaction on board? What actually is the purpose of this? So many questions, and it really deserves our research and our effort and time to ask the questions, do the legwork, and find out what this is really all about here. So I want to thank you for your attention this evening, and we're going to continue with our next episode tomorrow. We're going to dive into some of these old school drawings, and I want to thank you for your attention.
And that tells you that there is something out there.
Pretty hard to spoof that.
Absolutely. Los Alamos, Oak Ridge National Labs, MacDill Air Force Base, Edwards Air Force Base, the remote test site in Nevada, also known as Air Force Flight Test Center Detachment 3. That's the actual terminology for Groom Lake facility.
From what I hear you guys saying, there's something.
I don't know who's building it, who's got the technology, who's got the brains, but there's something out there that better than our airplane.
So it's not us. That's one thing we know.
We know that.
I could say that with a very high degree of confidence.
For someone to try to bust down the walls, it's not going to happen. You'd have to go to all these facilities, get into their vaults, then bring that out as a united coalition. Not one person couldn't do it. It would take a united coalition of acknowledged scientists to come forward with it.